June 2023, Norfolk, Virginia. Waterside lights glittered across the restaurant windows as I stepped inside in Navy service dress blues, the fabric still crisp from a morning flight out of Pensacola. For 6 months, I had taught tactical judgment to young officers who trusted MAPS math and the steady discipline of checklists. Tonight I promised myself I would sit, smile, eat cake, and make it through my cousin's wedding without turning anything into an operation. The host guided me past white linen tables and the soft chime of glassware. Laughter gathered and rolled the way laughter does when people are pleased with themselves. My mother, Ruth, adjusted the pearls at her throat and fixed her expression to the one she saved for public evenings. My brother, Mark, let his chair tip back just far enough to look casual while inviting attention. My cousin, Brianna, kept one eye on me and one eye on the small audience in her phone, a red light that never seemed to blink. I knew the drill. Nod, hug, deflect. I had carried radios through dust and heat and sat calm in rooms where a single word shifted an objective. Family should have been simpler. It never was. I set my cover down and waited for the first comment to land. It arrived on schedule. "Oh, look, someone said here comes our little clerk again." The tone was sweet and light. The smile was not. Another voice followed. Is that uniform for coffee service or attention? A couple of guests watched me over the rims of their flutes, interested in the show. I felt the familiar tug to explain what I do, to offer a clean map that would make my work safe for them. I let the urge pass. Explanation is often wasted on people who have already chosen the ending. A waiter paused at my shoulder. "Mom, will the honor guard be inside or outside for your arrival?" The question was practical and kind. Laughter rolled across the table, anyway wide and bright, as if the idea itself were the punchline. My mother lifted her hand in a small gesture that meant behave. Mark raised his glass to his own certainty. Brianna tilted her phone to catch my face. "They will know where to stand," I said. The waiter nodded and moved on. The band worked through a familiar set, drums, soft guitar, polite a voice promising forever. I could taste salt from the river and sugar from a cake no one had cut. I counted breaths and doorways and the minutes between. Old habits come dressed as patience. Family talk circled me like weather. Someone asked if I still traveled with a laptop. Someone else wanted to know if the Navy let me keep weekends. Mark joked about ministry being a harder deployment and laughed first to set the rhythm. My mother patted my arm and called me dear in a way that meant, do not make this bigger than it is. Brianna narrated to her viewers, eyes bright. Military Barbie made it, she said, blue suit and everything. Time stretched 10 minutes, then another. I felt the moment approach the way a sailor feels the wind turn. Doors carry a certain energy when people mean to enter with purpose. The band hesitated between songs. The servers slowed without knowing why. A hush gathered small at first, then steady like the sea drawing back before a wave. The doors opened. 3 sailors in dress white stepped through faces, composed movements exact. The United States flag led them forward color deep under the lights. The ceremonial sword flashed once. The steady beat of the ritual found the room and measured it. Conversations thinned to threads and then fell away. Brianna's phone lowered the lens, forgetting what it chased. Mark sat up without meaning to. My mother touched her pearls, as if contact could hold the moment still. The leader halted 3 steps from me and raised his voice. "Commander Elise Hartman, United States Navy Special Operations. Command Reaper 1 awaiting orders, Mom." The title placed each word where everyone could see it. The room slipped from noise to nothing. Forks hovered above plates. A camera slid from a hand and touched the floor with a soft clap. Quiet settled not as a burden, but as recognition. It is a sound, I know the sound a room makes when it learns where authority stands. "At ease, gentlemen," I said. Their shoulders softened by a degree that only practice can measure. My mother watched a daughter she did not recognize. My brother watched authority look back at him. Brianna watched numbers drop on her screen as silence did what spectacle could not. You can learn a great deal in a still moment. Who looks away first? who tries to laugh and cannot, who invents a new story because the old one has crumbled. Someone at the far table breathed a quiet apology that did not travel. I stood inside the quiet and let it do its work. The waiter who had asked his careful question stood by the door, hands folded, eyes on me. He had placed the honor guard precisely and on time. Professional people find one another in a crowd. I gave him the smallest nod and saw relief ease his posture. The three sailors held their bearing in a room that had turned itself inside out. They did not need applause. Neither did I. The laughter died faster than it began. They mocked the uniform. Now they would meet the commander, and the honor guard had not come for the groom. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, when the Navy ships were still the city's heartbeat, and every dinner table conversation carried the echo of someone's deployment. My father had already left by the time I could remember his face, a blur of khaki in an old photograph tucked in my mother's Bible. My mother, Ruth, spoke about him as if he were both saint and warning. She believed in service, but not for women. Her rules were simple and immovable. A woman should keep the house clean, her words quiet, and her ambitions smaller than the men around her. I learned early that silence kept the peace. My brother Mark was 8 years older and took that silence as permission. He was the golden one, the son who carried her hopes. By the time I turned 10, he had already begun practicing his sermons in the living room, preaching to the empty chairs, while I polished the silver tray that held his lemonade. When he paused to sip, he would nod at me and say things like, "Good girls make the world easier." I smiled because smiling was safer than arguing. I remember one evening in 1991, the TV showing news from Kuwait, grainy footage of soldiers stepping off planes. My mother clicked her tongue. "Those women are asking for trouble," she said. "That uniform ruins a woman." I didn't answer, but I watched the screen until she told me to turn it off. Something inside me understood even then that obedience could be its own kind of prison. High school passed like a long corridor of checklists. I joined JROTC in secret because it was the only place where structure felt fair. Orders were clear merit visible. You earned respect by competence, not by charm. I learned to tie knots faster than the boys, to march without breaking step, to read maps better than most of my instructors. At home, I folded laundry with the same precision. Mark was already studying theology, visiting on weekends with a new vocabulary of virtue. He called me little clerk, even before I had ever touched a typewriter. When I told him about JROTC, he laughed and said, "Maybe they will let you file paperwork for the brave ones." I kept my grades high enough for scholarships, partly out of pride, partly to escape. In the fall of 2001, during senior year, I sat in the school library when the towers fell. The room went silent. For weeks afterward, recruiters visited the campus, and I found myself listening with a pulse I didn't recognize. By December, I had filled out the ROTC application and mailed it before my mother could notice. The day the letter came back with the Navy's seal, I almost didn't open it. It was January 2002, cold enough that the window panes sweated. I read the first line and knew it was the doorway out. Full scholarship, Naval ROTC, University of Maryland. I folded the paper and hid it inside my algebra book. That night over dinner, I told my mother I had been accepted. She stirred her tea slowly. "No daughter of mine will go chasing men into war," she said. When I reached for the envelope, it wasn't there. She had already taken it. I searched her desk later and found only the torn edge of the seal in the trash. She said it was for my own good, that teaching would give me safety and respect. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I walked to the post office before sunrise, still in my uniform from school. I asked the clerk to print a duplicate from the ROTC office and mail it directly. It cost $7. I paid in singles I had saved from babysitting. A week later, another letter arrived addressed to me, care of the guidance counselor. When I opened it, I smiled for the first time in months. That was my first rebellion. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, I just moved forward. My mother found out only after the college sent her the financial forms. Her silence lasted 3 days, which was longer than any punishment she could have given. On the 4th morning, she told me to pack my suitcase. She didn't say goodbye when she dropped me at the bus station. I watched her car shrink down the highway until it was just the glint of sunlight on the rear window. At the University of Maryland, I wore the uniform for the first time. It was too large at the shoulders, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself that didn't ask permission to exist. The other cadets came from military families who sent care packages and letters. I came with nothing but the quiet endurance my mother had trained into me. Every salute I learned felt like an unspoken argument. Every mile I ran was a distance between who she wanted me to be and who I was becoming. During inspection one morning, my commanding officer corrected the tilt of my cap and said, "Attention to detail is a sign of respect, Hartman." I nodded. Respect was a word that meant something different to me. At home, it had meant silence. Here it meant precision. By senior year, my call sign among classmates was Hart, a play on my name and my tendency to volunteer for difficult drills. I smiled at the joke because they meant it kindly, not like my brother's version of little clerk. When graduation came, I mailed an invitation home. It came back unopened. I stood at parade rest during the commissioning ceremony and looked at the sea of parents clapping for their children. For a moment, I felt the ache of absence and then let it dissolve into the rhythm of the salute. The sun caught the brim of my cap, and I thought of my mother's words. A uniform ruins a woman. I knew better now. It had saved me. That summer, I shipped out to Great Lakes for basic officer training. The night before departure, I walked to the waterfront and watched the lights on the ships reflect across the water. Behind me, the wind carried the faint echo of church bells from downtown Norfolk. I could almost hear Mark's voice inside them, preaching about humility, about staying in your place. I smiled into the wind and whispered to no one in particular, "I have found mine." Even in uniform, I would always be the maid at home. But here, finally, the uniform answered back. Every salute was earned, none given freely. Pain had turned into defiance and defiance into direction. I didn't know yet that both would become the foundation for every battle ahead. The first winter at Great Lakes stripped away everything soft in me. The air smelled of fuel and salt, the kind of cold that made your breath taste metallic. We ran before dawn, boots hitting the pavement in rhythm, and every mistake echoed in the instructor's voice. Most recruits feared the shouting. I learned to listen between the words, to find the order hidden in the noise. Discipline was a language, and silence was fluency. I did not speak unless asked to. I did not fail. By the third month, I could field strip a rifle blindfolded and fold a bunk tight enough to bounce a coin. The same men who joked at first began to ask for my notes. Respect in the military is transactional. You earn it one flawless report at a time. When I graduated in 2003, my mother sent a single card with a Bible verse about humility. I read it once, folded it, and used it as a bookmark in the field manual. My assignment orders took me to San Diego, where Coronado's ocean wind carried the weight of ambition. I was placed in a logistics detachment supporting advanced training operations. To most, that meant spreadsheets, fuel records, and endless manifests. To me, it meant proximity to the real work. I watched candidates come back from the surf zone shivering, covered in sand, their eyes sharp and hollow. They called it Hell Week, but I saw something else in it, precision through pain. One evening, an instructor dropped a crate of equipment and barked for help. The men hesitated, half exhausted. I stepped in, cataloged the contents, logged the weights, and rerouted the shipment within an hour. The next morning, the instructor left a note on my desk, effective immediately. Hartman will oversee inbound training logistics. That small act turned into a pattern. When systems failed, I fixed them. When supplies lagged, I recalculated. I built order out of chaos and didn't need to announce it. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was clearance. In 2005, I was transferred to a joint operations base in Bahrain. The sun there did not set so much as fade, reluctantly leaving the heat behind. I managed inventory for special operations teams moving through the Gulf. The official title was Administrative Supply Officer. The reality was closer to control tower. Every flight manifest, every convoy route passed through my desk. I learned the cadence of risk, what a missing crate might mean for a mission, what a delayed flight could cost in lives. One night, a radio call came in from a team pinned outside Basra. Their supply truck had been hit, and the replacement route was blocked. The commanding officer hesitated. I rerouted a medical drone through unlisted airspace, flagged it as equipment recovery. The team lived. The next day, I was reprimanded for acting without authorization and quietly commended by the same officer over coffee. Rules are written for peace. Survival rewrites them in real time. By 2009, my name began to circulate within a narrow network of planners who valued initiative over obedience. I was invited to a briefing at Nellis Air Force Base where they discussed integration between field teams and remote tactical units. It was there I first heard the phrase tactical logistics. It sounded like an oxymoron, but I understood immediately. War was not just fought with weapons, but with timing, supply, and coordination. When they asked for volunteers to prototype the new command system, I raised my hand. By 2011, I was stationed in Kandahar, Afghanistan, running what the paperwork described as a coordination cell. The soldiers called it the cage, a cluster of screens and radios where missions intersected. My job was to anticipate failure before it happened. Weather, terrain, enemy movement, fuel. Every variable mattered. I slept 4 hours a night, ate from ration packs, and memorized call signs the way others memorized prayers. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was clearance. In March 2013, Operation Ember Shield began. A civilian convoy had been captured west of Kandahar, including 2 American engineers and a translator. Negotiations were collapsing. My orders were simple support only. That meant manage the drones, track the coordinates, and stay quiet. But when the lead pilot lost connection mid-flight and the ground team called in blind support became command, I took the radio, rerouted the second drone, and triangulated the escape corridor, using cargo transponders from a previous drop. The evac route cut straight through an abandoned riverbed. The convoy moved under the drone's cover while I recalculated fuel from the cage's console. 47 minutes later, all hostages were safe. No casualties. The team leader called me Reaper One, a joke about the drone channel I had commandeered. The name stuck. In the official report, my contribution was logged under support staff. In practice, I had led an extraction. I didn't correct the record. I didn't need to. Leadership sometimes means letting others keep their myths intact. When I returned to the States, I was promoted quietly. The new ID badge read, Commander, though the title arrived without ceremony. I carried it like a secret, a private medal no one could take back. On the flight home, a young Marine asked if I ever got scared. I told him fear is just information arriving early. He nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. The work taught me to think in layers. Cargo was not just boxes. Each manifest was a story, each shipment a pulse keeping something alive elsewhere. She moved cargo like chess pieces and people like missions. When soldiers spoke of heroes, they mentioned names on walls. I thought of the unseen hands routing those names through maps and fuel lines. By late 2013, I had learned the most useful lesson of all. Command isn't loud. It's the quiet that makes others move. That quiet followed me everywhere. In debriefs, they called it composure. In the field, it was survival. At home, it would soon become something else entirely. The orders granting me 2 weeks of leave arrived in early May 2023, stamped and signed in clean blue ink. I had not been home to Norfolk in years. My mother's health updates came secondhand through holiday cards and church newsletters, and my brother's voice reached me only through online sermons he streamed from a small chapel outside the city. I told myself I was attending my cousin Brianna's wedding to be polite, but truthfully, I wanted to see if time had changed the temperature of that house. The flight from Newport took barely an hour, though it felt like crossing an ocean I had spent decades learning to survive. When I stepped off the plane, the humidity of Virginia hit me like an old argument. I drove a rented sedan along the same coastal roads where I had once run drills as a cadet. Everything looked smaller now. My mother's house still had the same white porch with the same wind chime that rang too loudly in storms. She opened the door as if she had been waiting for a package, not a daughter. "You came," she said. I told her the Navy still believed in punctuality. She smiled in a way that carried more memory than warmth. Inside the walls were lined with Mark's framed photographs. His clerical collar gleamed in every one of them. The captions beneath each image read Family Honor Fund Gala or Charity Drive for Faith Renewal. His ministry had grown. So had his confidence. He arrived an hour later, his voice filling the room before his footsteps reached the carpet. "Ellie," he said, stretching my name into something friendly. "You look so official." I told him uniforms save time choosing outfits. He laughed, a sound rehearsed from years of preaching. Mother clapped her hands softly. "Our little file girl is back," she said, and the phrase hung in the air like a fly you couldn't quite swat. I pretended not to hear it. We spent dinner skimming through safe topics. Mark spoke of sermons, donations, and the importance of community generosity. Brianna's wedding came up halfway through the meal. Mark leaned forward, his tone bright. "You'll love what she's done," he said. "She's turned her big day into a charity event. All proceeds to the Family Honor Fund." Mother nodded approvingly. "That girl understands gratitude." I smiled, though something in me tightened. Gratitude in this family had always meant compliance. After dinner, I walked to the porch, phone in hand, scrolling through Brianna's social media. The first post that caught my eye was a video titled, "Building My Dream Wedding Through Faith." She spoke into the camera from inside a boutique twirling in a designer gown. Hashtag community generosity. Hashtag family honor. The caption read, "Blessed to be supported by our ministry family." Below it, a donation link led to the Family Honor Fund. I clicked. The page listed several anonymous sponsors, including one marked Military Support Division. I knew that label. It was the name of a dormant account connected to veteran outreach funds, a program Mark had once asked me to endorse years ago. I never did. The Navy had shut it down after an audit. Seeing it resurrected under his church's fund made my stomach drop. I spent the next hour tracing the donation trail. The transactions weren't large individually, but they were systematic small transfers funneled through multiple sub-accounts linked to old service charities. Someone had found a way to rebrand military residual funds as church donations. My brother's voice echoed from the living room as he spoke to my mother about guest lists. They didn't invite her for love. They needed her silence. I took a deep breath, opened my secure contacts, and called an old acquaintance from the Navy's Financial Compliance Office. I didn't mention names, only asked how long an inactive military outreach account could remain visible after closure. The answer was clear. Not long enough to explain what I was seeing. The next morning, I attended service at Mark's church. The sanctuary was bright, filled with screens projecting his image larger than life. He preached about stewardship and integrity. Every line had been polished until it gleamed. He ended with a plea for continued support of the Family Honor Fund, describing it as a vessel for healing veterans and strengthening families. Applause followed like a reflex. I looked around at the crowd, mostly retirees and small business owners, all convinced their dollars were sanctified. Faith was currency in this family, and Mark had learned to mint it. After the service, I caught the accountant in the hallway. She was young, mid-20s, with a nervous smile. I introduced myself as Commander Hartman and asked for 5 minutes of her time. We spoke in a side office with the door cracked open. I asked about the Military Support Division. Her eyes darted toward the window before she said anything. Pastor Mark handles all transfers personally. We just categorize them. I asked if she had digital records. She nodded. I asked if she minded clarifying a few details for the Navy's Veterans Department. Her tone changed instantly. "Is something wrong?" I smiled, calm and measured. Nothing yet. She logged into her system and scrolled through a series of transactions. I pressed record on my phone under the table. Every detail, every timestamp, every confirmation tone became part of the file. I didn't interrupt. I just let her speak. When she finished, I thanked her, left the office, and sat in my car with the windows down. The folder on my phone glowed like a quiet fuse, waiting for ignition. That evening at home, my mother watched the news while I reviewed the audio. She glanced over, occasionally sensing something different in my stillness. "You always were too serious," she said. "You should learn to let things go." I told her I was just catching up on family matters. She nodded, not understanding the edge in my tone. Later that night, I looked out the window toward the bay. The reflection of the moon split on the water like a blade. I thought about the way silence had protected me in uniform and how it might serve me again here. The next few days unfolded like reconnaissance. Brianna's wedding rehearsal streamed live, her laughter bright, her followers sending hearts and prayers. Each post tagged Family Honor Fund. I took screenshots, cataloged them, time-stamped each one. When people lie publicly, evidence becomes effortless. I planned my response the way I planned missions, quietly and without warning. I would not embarrass them yet. Not until the audience was largest, not until every word could land where it mattered. In this family, faith was currency, and I had just learned its exchange rate. My leave was only halfway done, but I already knew the operation's name. I wrote it at the top of a clean notebook, Ember 2. It would start at Brianna's wedding and end with silence breaking loud enough to echo beyond the church walls. The wedding morning broke with the kind of sunlight that looks good on camera. Norfolk's air was thick with summer sweetness, the smell of magnolia and baked sugar drifting from the kitchen. I woke early, uniform, pressed metals, polished but modest, the small silver trident glinting faintly in the mirror. It was not vanity, it was discipline. I had worn this uniform in places where silence was the only language that mattered. Today, I would wear it into the loudest room of my life. The Waterside District restaurant gleamed with soft lighting and pastel decor. Brianna had spared no expense, and neither had her followers. Everywhere I looked, there was a phone on a tripod, a ring light reflecting in the champagne flutes, a live chat scrolling across someone's screen. I walked through the door just as the DJ faded out of a country song. Heads turned, the cameras followed. I heard Brianna's voice before I saw her. "Well, look who finally arrived," she said brightly into her phone. "Military Barbie's here." Laughter rippled through the guests. Some smiled apologetically, others just stared. My mother adjusted her shawl and whispered something to Mark. He laughed too, a deep performative sound meant to claim the moment. They laughed into a microphone. I made my way to the table assigned to family near the front, but conveniently close to the exit. The centerpiece smelled of fake lavender. The tablecloths were white enough to reflect every flash of every camera. Mark stood at the head of the room talking to guests about faith and family. He moved like a man accustomed to stages. When he noticed me, his smile widened just slightly, that practiced pastoral warmth that hides steel underneath. He raised his glass and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, my sister is with us tonight. She serves in the Navy." He paused for applause that came politely, unevenly. Then he added, "She files papers, not flight plans, so we don't have to worry about her going missing in action." The guests laughed again. Someone's phone captured it. The camera caught the sparkle of his cufflinks, the glint of the cross at his throat, and the way he smirked after his own punchline. I sat still. My fork hovered above the plate. I could feel my pulse slow down instead of rise the same way it did before field briefings. Control is a muscle. You train it until it holds. I glanced at the window where the bay light shimmered. The sound of the crowd faded into something distant. When I turned back, Brianna was leaning across the table, eyes gleaming. "Don't take it too hard, Aunt Elise," she said. "People just like to laugh." I smiled. "People laugh for many reasons," I said. She tilted her head, not catching the meaning. My mother reached for my arm. "He was just joking," she murmured. I told her I knew. Her hand trembled slightly. That told me more than her words did. The food came out salmon glazed with honey bread rolls soft enough to collapse at touch, and the wedding cake towering under glass. The photographer circled like a hawk, catching laughter and posed tears. Everything was curated, staged to look effortless. Every inch of that room was a broadcast. Brianna's phone sat propped against a candle holder, red light blinking, recording her own family as background content. I wondered how many viewers were watching when Mark said those words. I wondered how long before someone replayed them. The DJ called for a toast. Mark thanked the congregation for their donations to the Family Honor Fund. His tone, righteous, his hands open in practiced humility. I looked around at the smiling faces, people who had no idea their generosity had been siphoned from an old military account. The irony nearly made me laugh. They thought this was a celebration of faith. It was a ledger in disguise. One of the servers approached, balancing a tray of champagne glasses. He was young, maybe 20, wearing a slightly oversized vest. He leaned toward me and whispered, "Ma'am, will the honor guard be inside or outside for your arrival?" The question was simple, respectful, but it sliced through the noise. Heads turned again. Someone giggled, another person whispered, "Honor guard. What's that?" I met the server's eyes, steady and calm. "They'll know where to stand," I said. He nodded and moved on, unaware he had just set the rhythm for what would follow. My mother sighed heavily, sensing trouble she couldn't name. Brianna leaned closer to her phone, eyes sparkling. "What was that about Annalise?" she teased. "Got some soldiers coming to salute you." Her followers flooded the chat with emojis. I looked at her and smiled gently. "Just part of the ceremony," I said. She blinked, confused. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the music resumed louder than before, as if the sound itself could smooth over the tension. I let them have their noise. Noise is what fills a room before the truth arrives. I watched the clock discreetly timing my next move. The waiters cleared plates, the wine glasses refilled. I sat through conversations about honeymoons and house renovations. Someone asked if I was dating anyone. Someone else joked about me being married to the Navy. Every remark layered itself neatly atop the last until the entire night felt rehearsed. I said little, smiled when expected, nodded when required. It wasn't hard. Years of military briefings teach you how to endure arrogance wrapped in civility. Some medals are earned in silence, others in restraint. I could feel the recording on my phone, heavy in my bag, the quiet assurance that justice doesn't need an audience to prepare. The time would come. Near midnight, Brianna announced she was going live again for a special toast. Her voice carried across the speakers, syrupy and triumphant. To family, to faith, to generosity. Everyone cheered. Mark raised his glass again, bathed in the warm light of his own reputation. He glanced at me, confident that I would clap along. I did not. I simply watched him calm and still, as one might study a storm's movement before it breaks. The recording continued. The laughter rolled on, but the current in the room had shifted. They just didn't know it yet. That night, as I left, the moonlight caught on the insignia of my uniform. A reflection flashed across the window, a mirror of what was coming. The laughter had already started to fade in my ears, replaced by the quiet certainty that some reckonings arrive dressed as ceremonies. The night air outside the venue was cooler than I expected, the bay wind brushing across the polished brass of the honor guard's swords. 3 officers stood waiting in their dress whites, posture straight, eyes forward. I had called in the favor quietly through channels that did not need explanation. They did not know the details, only that Commander Hartman required ceremonial presence at a private event. I looked through the glass doors where the laughter continued inside. The sound was muffled, but I could still hear Mark's voice leading another prayer, his tone rich and theatrical. I waited until the music shifted, until the band paused between sets. Timing was everything in war and in families like mine. I nodded to the lead officer. He returned the signal and lifted the flagstaff slightly. The other 2 adjusted formation. When I opened the door, the air from inside rushed outward, warm and heavy with perfume sugar and the sour tang of champagne. Heads turned instantly. The drums began a slow, deliberate cadence that filled the hall like heartbeat. Every step the honor guard took seemed to erase a layer of the evening's pretense. The flag unfurled under the lights, and the metallic ring of the saber's hilt caught the room's attention before the meaning did. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Cameras rose, flashing blindly without understanding what they were witnessing. I walked behind the guard, each click of my shoes measured and precise. The DJ's microphone caught the echo, projecting it through the speakers by accident. It sounded like a verdict. The lead officer stopped 3 paces from the head table, his voice clear and resonant. Commander Elise Hartman, United States Navy, Special Operations Command, Reaper 1. Awaiting orders, ma'am. The words landed like thunder contained in glass. I stepped forward and faced the room. Before you toast, I said, let's talk about honor and where it belongs. The servers froze mid-motion. Brianna lowered her phone slowly, her followers watching a stream that no longer made sense. Mark tried to stand, but his chair caught on the carpet, tilting awkwardly. My mother covered her mouth. The projector screen flickered to life behind me, the same one Brianna had planned to use for her wedding montage. Instead of photographs, the first image was a receipt. It showed a wire transfer from the Family Honor Fund to Bree Lux Media LLC, dated 2 weeks before the ceremony. I clicked again. Another receipt appeared, then another. Donations labeled Community Generosity had been funneled directly into wedding expenses, catering, decor, the designer gown. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the projector fan. Mark found his voice first. Elise, this is inappropriate, he said, tone sharp but trembling. You will sit down now. I turned toward him slowly. Sit down, I repeated, as if testing the sound of authority on family ears. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some took cautious steps back. I clicked once more, and the video began to play. The clip showed Mark laughing during his toast earlier that night. She files papers, not flight plans, he said, and the room had laughed with him. Hearing it replayed through speakers stripped it of charm. The laughter now sounded brittle, cruel. The room froze before the clip ended. I let the silence stretch until it felt like gravity. Then I spoke, calm, deliberate. You mocked a uniform that paid for your lies. Every donation you took came from people who believed in integrity, in service, in truth. You used faith as camouflage. The flag behind me caught the breeze from an open window and moved slightly its shadow, stretching across the floor like judgment. Mark stood again, voice cracking. You think you can humiliate your family for what revenge pride? I shook my head. No, for accuracy. I gestured toward the officers. Gentlemen, thank you. Dismissed. They saluted sharply, then turned in unison and exited the drums, fading into distance. The flag remained. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, replaced by nothing at all. No applause, no whispers. Just the fragile stillness of people realizing they had witnessed the collapse of a performance. My mother's pearls rattled softly as her hands shook. Brianna whispered to her phone, forgetting it was still live. I could see the chat feed exploding with comments, fragments of disbelief and sympathy. The clip of Mark's words replayed automatically once more, the system looping it. He filed papers, not flight plans. This time, no one laughed. He sank back into his chair, eyes glassy, the sermon voice gone. I closed the projector, folded my notes, and said, There will be questions, legal ones. I suggest you prepare honest answers. Then I stepped away from the microphone. She didn't shout. The flag did it for her. As I walked toward the door, the music equipment clicked faintly, waiting for new input. The DJ avoided my eyes. The guests began murmuring, cautious, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of the drums as the honor guard disappeared down the street. I stood at the curb, breathing in the cool air that tasted of salt and endings. Behind me, the room that had once held laughter now held only truth, steady and unrelenting. By July, the clip had already escaped Norfolk. Someone at the wedding had uploaded it within hours, and by morning it had migrated to Reddit, Facebook, and every news aggregator with an appetite for scandal. The headline was as sharp as a knife. Commander exposes her family's scam honor guard, witnessed it all. The thumbnail showed me standing beside the flag hand steady, face calm, while Mark sat frozen mid-laugh. It It was the kind of image that didn't need context. By the end of the week, millions had watched it. Local radio hosts replayed the audio of his toast, followed by my line about honor, treating it like a modern parable. Comment sections filled with veterans and churchgoers, arguing over faith, power, and money. Some called me brave. Others called me heartless. I didn't respond. The Navy Public Affairs Office contacted me once, asking if I needed counsel for potential press inquiries. I told them it was a personal matter, not an operational one. They left it at that. The Department of Justice didn't. 2 weeks later, I received an email from a federal investigator requesting documentation related to the Family Honor Fund. They already had the receipts and the audio. What they wanted was confirmation that the Military Support Division had been inactive for nearly a decade. I sent the official closure letter within the hour. It was enough to open a case. The IRS followed days later. They froze the fund's accounts pending review. Mark's church board issued a temporary suspension while they awaited clarification. I watched the announcement stream live on their website. His face looked smaller without the pulpit lights, his voice subdued as he claimed misunderstanding. The congregants clapped weakly. The faith that once held them together now hung by a thread. My mother refused to believe any of it. She called one evening, her voice brittle. "Elise, you have destroyed your brother's ministry. Do you feel proud?" I told her pride had nothing to do with it. She said, "You have betrayed the bloodline." I answered, "You taught obedience. The Navy taught me duty." She hung up before I could finish the sentence. The silence afterward felt heavier than any reprimand. Reporters began circling the neighborhood, filming the church, chasing parishioners as they left Sunday service. The footage was everywhere. The banner under the news anchor's face read "Family Fund under Federal Investigation." I didn't watch most of it, but friends sent me clips anyway. In one, a woman who had donated to the fund wept on camera saying she thought she was helping veterans. In another, a man shouted that faith had become business. Each testimony cut deeper into Mark's armor. In families like mine, truth was treason. By August, the case had moved from inquiry to indictment. The evidence trail was clean and digital. Every transfer from the Family Honor Fund led to Brianna's wedding vendors. Every false report carried Mark's signature. The accountant confirmed her statements under oath. She looked terrified in court, but relief softened her face when she saw me sitting quietly in the gallery. I didn't testify. I didn't need to. The facts spoke louder than memory ever could. Mark's defense argued mismanagement, not fraud. They said it was a clerical oversight, a misunderstanding of accounting categories. The judge didn't look convinced. The prosecutors played the same wedding clip the world had already memorized. They filed it as Exhibit 7A. When the screen filled with Mark's image laughing, saying she files papers, not flight plans, the courtroom stilled. The audio ended. Then my line followed, clear and measured. "You mocked a uniform that paid for your lies." He dug his own grave on live camera. My mother sat behind me that day, her expression a fortress. She never looked at me, only at the floor. When the hearing adjourned, she left without a word. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Their questions blurred together. "Commander, did you plan this? Commander, what does justice mean to you? Commander, do you forgive your brother?" I walked past them without breaking stride. Forgiveness was a language I had not yet decided to learn. The investigation widened. The Department of Justice issued a statement confirming misuse of nonprofit funds totaling $120,000. The Navy's Internal Ethics Office commended my cooperation. I declined interviews. My phone rang constantly from journalists, advocacy groups, talk shows. I answered none. The only call I returned came from a sergeant who had served under me in Kandahar. "Ma'am," he said, "I saw the video. You didn't blink." I told him blinking had never been part of the job description. September arrived with a new kind of quiet. The church closed temporarily. The sign out front read, "Under renovation," though everyone knew it meant something else. My mother stopped attending Sunday service. She told neighbors she was focusing on prayer at home. I knew the truth. She couldn't face the stairs. I visited her once unannounced. The house smelled the same old roses and disinfectant. She sat in the living room surrounded by unopened letters. The TV murmured with low volume. When she saw me, her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She asked, "Why did you have to make it public?" I said, "Because they made it public first." She didn't answer. We sat in silence until the clock struck 5. I left a folder on the table containing the evidence, clean copies of everything. "You can read it when you're ready," I said. She nodded without meeting my eyes. Outside, cicadas screamed in the late summer heat. On the drive back to base, I passed the church again. The windows were dark. A single banner still fluttered on the fence, Family Honor Fund Serving with Faith. The irony was almost poetic. In families like ours, faith had always been currency, and Mark had finally overdrawn the account. When the verdict came, it was conditional restitution, community service removal from leadership for 5 years. Some said it was mercy. I called it math. Every dollar returned was a confession written in numbers. The internet moved on to the next scandal, but in Norfolk the echo lingered. People still pointed, still whispered. I ignored them. I had weathered worse storms with less shelter. One evening, I walked along the pier where the ships docked, watching their lights pulse across the water. The wind carried the faint smell of diesel and salt, the scent of home and duty intertwined. I thought of the phrase engraved inside the academy gate, non sibi sed patriae, not for self, but for country. My brother had built his kingdom on faith. I had built mine on discipline. His had collapsed. Mine remained standing. By autumn, the storm had settled into consequences. The headlines no longer needed my name to draw attention. They used his instead. Viral pastor under investigation read the banner on Fox Norfolk, the photo of Mark framed against his own pulpit like a man trapped inside his brand. The IRS had finished its audit. Their conclusion was brutal in its precision. The Family Honor Fund had misrepresented charitable intent, diverted donations to personal use, and fabricated expense reports under the signature of its founder, Pastor Mark Hartman. It wasn't just mismanagement anymore. It was fraud dressed as faith. The church board voted unanimously to remove him from leadership. The denomination's central office issued a statement calling the situation regrettable and inconsistent with the values of their ministry. Mark issued his own video the next day, filmed from his living room. The curtains were drawn, his Bible open on the table, his tone soft with practiced humility. He claimed misunderstanding, persecution, and betrayal, but the internet has a long memory. Commenters filled the chat with the same words he once used to shame others: hypocrite, grifter, fraud. Public humiliation doesn't arrive like lightning. It builds steady and visible until it collapses the structure you thought was safe. He had built his kingdom on image. Now the image was the crime scene. Brianna's downfall arrived faster. Someone on Reddit connected her wedding livestream with the fund receipts and started a thread titled, "The Influencer Who Scammed Her Own Church." It spread overnight. Screenshots of her posts flooded the internet, her captions about gratitude, her designer gown, her smug smile beside the donation link. Someone found her online shop selling shirts printed with the slogan, "Support the troops." The irony was so sharp, it drew blood. Within days, her sponsors dropped her. The charity that had partnered for her community outreach canceled all contracts. Then came the lawsuit, a class action filed by donors demanding the return of their contributions. Her apology video lasted 7 minutes. She cried exactly on cue, blamed poor accounting, and thanked her followers for understanding. The comments section didn't. The video reached 500,000 dislikes before she deleted it. Online collapse doesn't look like explosion. It looks like silence after a scream. My mother's punishment was quieter, but crueler. The congregation she once ruled through social charm began to avoid her. People crossed the street rather than wave. The women who used to call every afternoon stopped. Her social calendar emptied. She told neighbors she preferred solitude, but the truth was visible in the uncut grass and uncollected mail. She became the last loyalist to a fallen empire. When reporters came knocking, she said only one sentence. My daughter betrayed her brother. I never corrected her. Isolation does its own work. In early September, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea watching the local news replay the Fox segment. The anchor's voice was steady, professional. The headline glowed beneath him, "Viral Pastor Under Investigation." Behind that phrase was every lesson I had ever learned about consequence. Some wars end in courtrooms. I stirred the tea slowly, the spoon clinking against porcelain like a metronome. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. Outside, cicadas rasped in the fading heat. The world felt balanced again, not peaceful but precise. Justice served without salutes. I hadn't lifted a finger since that night at the wedding. The truth had done all the work. The week after the broadcast, Mark sold the church building to cover legal fees. The stained glass came down, boxed up, auctioned off to pay restitution. Brianna moved to Florida, reinventing herself under a new account name. Her follower count limped along at a fraction of what it once was. My mother stopped answering the phone entirely. The neighbors whispered about dementia, though I knew it wasn't that. It was shame calcified into silence. I mailed her groceries every Friday anyway. No return address, just a note that said, "Keep the faith." The irony was deliberate. One afternoon, a Navy colleague dropped by my office at the War College with a newspaper folded under his arm. He set it on my desk without a word. The front page showed Mark leaving the courthouse. His head bowed the caption, quoting him saying he would dedicate himself to reflection and service. My colleague looked at me waiting for comment. I said nothing. He smiled faintly. "You didn't have to fight this one, ma'am. I told him I did, just differently." He nodded and left. That evening, I walked home through the base, the sky streaked with late summer orange. The sound of marching cadence from a distant drill reached my ears. It reminded me of everything the Navy had taught me about endurance. Silence was not surrender. It was strategy. I thought about my family and the word legacy. Some inherit wealth, some inherit wreckage. I had both and neither. I passed the chapel on base and stopped by the open door. A chaplain was arranging hymnals, humming softly. He saw me and nodded. "Evening, Commander." I asked how long he had served. He said 30 years. I told him my brother had once been a pastor. He smiled kindly. "Then you know the difference between preaching and practicing." I did. On my desk at home sat the tea mug from that night, the bottom stained with the color of consequence. She didn't lift a finger, just the truth. The following week, a reporter from a national outlet emailed asking for an exclusive. The subject line read, "The Commander Who Exposed the Fraud." I deleted it. There was nothing left to expose. The truth had already finished its mission. The call came on a Sunday afternoon in July 2024. I was sorting papers in my office when the phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved but instantly recognized. The silence between rings carried something familiar, a hesitation only guilt could produce. When I answered, his voice came through rough and uncertain. "Ellie," he said, "Mom's sick. We need you." For a moment, I said nothing. The clock ticked on the wall each second, heavy as a sentence. "You needed me years ago," I said finally. "Now you need forgiveness. I'm not cleared for that." He didn't argue. The line stayed open long enough for me to hear him exhale the kind of sound a man makes when he realizes negotiation won't work. He said the hospital name, then the words, "She's asking for you." The call ended with a click that sounded final, but wasn't. I sat still for a long time the way I used to before issuing an order that would change a mission's course. Duty and mercy often look similar on paper, but the intent behind them was never the same. That night, I logged into the hospital's billing system. Old habits die slowly, especially those tied to systems and access. I opened a new account under the name A Benefactor and entered a transfer that would cover every expense from diagnostics to discharge. No signature, no traceable link. The payment confirmation blinked once before disappearing. Mercy without reunion. I didn't visit. My mother had spent a lifetime teaching me that love meant obedience. It was time she learned the opposite. Days passed. The news cycle had long forgotten the scandal. Norfolk moved on, though whispers still circled the church ruins and local diners. Mark's name had become a cautionary tale, an echo people used to measure their own distance from disgrace. He hadn't called again. I imagined him at the hospital trying to pray in a voice that no longer convinced even him. The following week, an envelope arrived at my office addressed only to Commander Hartman. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on stationery from a small congregation in Norfolk. The handwriting was careful, the kind that belongs to someone unaccustomed to writing long messages. It read, "Dear Commander, you don't know me, but I attended Pastor Hartman's church for years. When the news came out, I thought I'd never see my donation again. Yesterday, I got a refund check with an anonymous note that said, 'Truth pays its own debts.' Because of you, I got my refund. Thank you for showing what integrity looks like." I folded the letter and sat back staring at the words until they blurred. The Navy teaches efficiency, not emotion, but there are moments when acknowledgement feels heavier than medals. Forgiveness is not access. That night, I drove past the hospital. The lights on the upper floors glowed faintly through the mist. I didn't stop. Through the glass, I could see visitors coming and going, carrying flowers and plastic bags of comfort that would wilt before morning. I wondered if my mother knew someone had already paid the bills. Maybe she thought it was divine providence. Maybe that was enough. The next morning, the hospital confirmed her discharge. I received the notification automatically, a byproduct of the anonymous account. A week later, Mark called again. His voice was steadier this time. "She's home," he said. "I wanted to thank whoever helped. I told him gratitude was unnecessary." He hesitated. "Was it you?" I let the silence answer for me. He sighed. "I don't know how to fix any of this, Ellie." I said, "You don't fix truth. You live with it." He whispered goodbye before hanging up. It sounded more like surrender than farewell. In August, I received another letter from the same churchgoer. This time, it was shorter. They had reopened under new leadership. The final line said, "People talk less about the scandal now. They talk more about integrity." It felt strange realizing the mess my family had created had somehow become a lesson for others. In families like mine, that was the closest thing to redemption anyone could expect. One evening, as summer thinned into early autumn, I found myself on the base pier, again tea in hand, watching the waves flatten against the concrete. The horizon was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows completion. A young lieutenant approached, saluted, and said he had seen the clip years ago during ethics training. He called it the moment he decided to re-enlist. I smiled, told him decisions made for the right reasons usually survive the hardest tests. He thanked me and walked away. I stayed until the sun dipped low and the water turned bronze. The city lights blinked awake across the bay, ordinary and distant. I thought about my family scattered now across guilt and geography. Mercy had been given, but the door stayed closed. Some stories don't need reconciliation to end. They just need truth to remain standing. Winter came early to Norfolk in 2024, the kind of cold that carried the smell of sea and rust through every cracked window. The first snow fell on a Friday, soft and almost apologetic. I was in my office at the War College when the call came from the hospital. The nurse's voice was calm, trained to deliver news that still managed to hollow out the air. "Your mother passed early this morning," she said, peaceful in her sleep. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat still. There was no shock, only the quiet recognition that something inevitable had finally kept its appointment. Outside the window, cadets hurried across the courtyard, collars pulled high against the wind. Life, as it always does, continued its drills. I didn't request leave. I didn't book a flight. The funeral was scheduled for the following week at St. Mary's, the same church where she had once sat in the front pew, where my brother had preached about obedience and sacrifice. He sent an email with the subject line "Service Details." It contained a polite summary of the arrangements and a closing line that said, "She wanted peace between us." I read it twice, then closed the message. Some wars end in silence. The morning of the funeral, I unfolded the flag from its display case. It was the same one presented to me after a fallen comrade's memorial years ago, the same weight, the same fold, the same precision. I pressed its edges flat, placed it inside a plain brown box, and attached a small handwritten note. For the woman who taught me silence, and what it costs. The delivery service confirmed drop-off at the church an hour before the ceremony began. I imagined it sitting among the flowers and hymnals, the flag a quiet presence that said everything I couldn't. I spent the day walking the base perimeter, the snow crunching under my boots, the air sharp enough to sting. The wind carried fragments of faint bells from the town. They sounded distant, filtered through distance and memory. I wondered who spoke her eulogy. Probably Mark, his voice polished again by repentance, telling stories about a mother who loved fiercely and raised her children in faith. Maybe he believed it now. Maybe belief was his last remaining comfort. That evening, when I returned to my quarters, an envelope waited under the door. The handwriting stopped me. It was hers. The postmark was from the week before her death. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded, in places the writing uneven. "My dearest Elise," it began, "I do not know if you will ever understand the choices I made. I thought I was protecting you from a world that would never forgive strong women. I see now that you were never the one who needed forgiveness." The letter ended abruptly, the last line unfinished except for 4 words that trailed into nothing. "You were right about respect." I stared at the page for a long time. The words were simple, not a confession, not even an apology, but they carried the one thing she had withheld all her life: acknowledgement. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the flag case beneath the glass, the ink visible just above the blue field of stars. Not every salute is returned. She buried her past in a folded flag. Weeks passed. The snow melted into gray slush. The holidays came and went. The house in Norfolk was sold quietly by the bank. Mark sent another email saying he was moving west for mission work. I replied with 2 words: safe travels. In January, a small package arrived from the funeral home containing her personal effects. Inside were a rosary, a pair of pearl earrings, and a worn prayer book. Tucked between its pages was a photograph of me in uniform, one I hadn't known she kept. The edges were frayed from handling. I placed it beside the letter, the circle finally closed. That night, I brewed tea and sat by the window watching the harbor lights. Somewhere out there, a ship's horn sounded long and low, rolling through the dark like an old memory coming home. I thought about her silence, how it had shaped every part of me, how it had once felt like a weapon and now strangely like peace. I lifted the cup and whispered into the empty room, "Rest easy, Ruth. You were right about respect." Morning light spread over Newport like a slow tide, pale and deliberate, brushing the Navy War College buildings in soft gold. I arrived early, the corridor still echoing with the hum of heating vents and the faint rhythm of shoes on waxed floors. My office overlooked the harbor where the ships rested in neat lines, quiet as sleeping giants. I had grown used to the routine mentoring young officers who came through the program, full of ambition, impatience, and untested certainty. My badge now read, Senior Advisor Leadership and Ethics. Titles change, but the mission remains. Teach them what endurance really looks like. One of my mentees, Lieutenant Kim Lopez, arrived that morning with the same brisk knock she always used when she wanted to appear confident. She was small, sharp-eyed, and brilliant with strategy, but still learning diplomacy. She sat across from me, papers balanced neatly in her hands. Her record showed promise and tension in equal measure. I had seen the same combination many times before, especially in women trying to prove themselves in a room full of men who assumed the definition of command was gendered. She hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am," she said, voice steady but careful, How do you deal with those who mock your rank? I looked at her for a long moment. The question wasn't theoretical. She had been stationed with a unit that dismissed her authority until she solved their navigation crisis overnight. I leaned back, letting the sunlight catch the edges of my medals framed on the wall. "You don't," I said finally. "You just make sure they end up saluting." She blinked, then smiled the kind of smile that holds both relief and recognition. I told her that rank means nothing if you use it to argue. It only means something when the results speak louder than the resentment. She nodded slowly, writing something in her notebook. I could see the words forming before she finished, proved by precision, not defense. The week unfolded as most did: lectures, briefings, endless paperwork. But this class was different. Halfway through the semester, I noticed one of the students watching me more closely than usual. He was older than the others, a reservist completing his leadership credits. His name tag read Collins. During a discussion on command under pressure, he raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but unfamiliar in its warmth. "I think I've met you before." The class laughed lightly. I smiled and said, "The Navy's a small world, Lieutenant." He shook his head. "No, ma'am, not that small. You wouldn't remember me, but I was with the Honor Guard in Norfolk 2 years ago. We saluted you at a wedding." The laughter stopped. Even Lopez looked up, startled. Collins continued steady, respectful. "Ma'am, they should have known who you were." I felt the room still the way it does before an incoming tide. For a heartbeat, I was back in that hall, hearing the drums, the silence, the weight of the flag. Then it was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scratch of Lopez's pen on paper. I smiled, small and genuine. They do now. The class didn't know what to say. Collins nodded once, no theatrics, just acknowledgement. The conversation shifted back to case studies, but something in the air had changed. Respect isn't given. It's remembered. After class, Lopez lingered. She asked if the story was true. I told her only the parts that mattered. The rest belonged to time and consequence. She laughed softly and said, "Sometimes I think respect is just fear polished into admiration." I told her fear fades. Integrity doesn't. She wrote that one down too. That evening, I walked along the pier, the wind sharp but clean. The ships rocked gently, lights flickering on their decks. I thought about the years behind me, the people who had tested my patience, the silence that had once been a shield and later a weapon. Now it was something simpler, a kind of peace earned through exhaustion. The phone buzzed once in my pocket, a message from Mark. It said, "Mom's house finally sold. Proceeds donated to veterans housing." I stared at the screen, then typed back, "Good." That's where honor belongs. No signature, no emotion, just closure. A gull screamed above its sound, thin against the water. I watched the sky shift from blue to iron gray, the day surrendering to dusk. The reflection of the college lights shimmered across the bay like strands of gold scattered by wind. At dinner that night, Lopez joined me and a few instructors. She talked about her upcoming assignment, a command role aboard a coastal reconnaissance vessel. She looked both excited and terrified. I told her that meant she was ready. Before she left, she asked if she could borrow one of my quotes for her graduation speech. "Which one?" I asked. She grinned. "The one about making them salute." I laughed quietly. "Use it wisely." A week later, during the closing ceremony, I stood at the back of the auditorium as the new graduates received their certificates. The flag hung behind the stage, its fabric heavy and perfect. When Lopez crossed the stage, she caught my eye briefly and straightened her shoulders before saluting. It wasn't for show. It was gratitude disguised as ritual. Afterward, Collins approached me once more, this time without an audience. He said he had transferred to the Reserve Training Command, inspired by that night in Norfolk. He wanted to teach younger sailors about honor. He paused before leaving and said that wedding might have been the end of something for them, but it was the start of something for the rest of us. I thanked him, though words felt inadequate. He saluted again before turning away. Reputation is the echo of restraint. The following morning, I wrote a note to the dean recommending Lopez for early promotion. I ended it with one sentence: She understands the quiet part of leadership. Later in my office, I opened the case on my shelf and looked at the folded flag resting inside. The letter from my mother still lay beneath it, her final line visible through the glass. "You were right about respect." I touched the glass lightly as if to seal the words in place. Outside, the sound of cadets marching reached my window, steady and certain. Their cadence was strong, their voices blending into something larger than themselves. I whispered the same phrase I had told Lopez. "You don't argue with those who mock your rank. You just make sure they end up saluting." The sea outside my window was calm, again gray and endless, the kind of quiet that no longer asks for attention. A year had passed since everything unraveled and then rebuilt itself into something simpler. The storms had gone, but their lessons stayed. I spent my mornings writing letters for the Academy's archives, reflections, for the next generation of officers who would walk these halls long after my boots stopped echoing through them. One of those letters began the same way every time. Teach them to lead without proving to speak without shouting. I wrote it slowly, the words deliberate, shaped by every silence that had once felt like defeat. Leadership, I had learned, was not about the noise it made, but the steadiness it left behind. That thought became the cornerstone of a foundation I had been building quietly with a few colleagues and friends. We called it Women of Command. The goal was small and direct: to provide scholarships and counseling for women veterans transitioning out of service, those who had carried the weight of leadership without the recognition that often came with it. The Navy had given me purpose. This was how I returned it. The paperwork took months, the kind of bureaucratic marathon that would have once irritated me. Now it felt like meditation. Every form, every signature was another quiet assertion that legacy didn't need grandeur to endure. When the first grant check went out, I kept the receipt pinned on my board beside a photograph of my cadets marching in winter sunlight. The program didn't make headlines, but I didn't need it to. Reputation is the echo of restraint. One afternoon near the end of spring, I stopped at a Walmart outside town to pick up stationery and a replacement tea kettle. The store hummed with the slow rhythm of an ordinary weekday. In the checkout line, a familiar voice said, "Paper or plastic, ma'am." I turned. Brianna stood behind the register, hair pulled back, uniform vest clean but faded. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She swallowed hard, the practiced brightness in her face cracking around the edges. "Nice uniform," I said. The words came out softer than I expected. She blinked, eyes filling. "Yes, ma'am." Her voice barely carried. I nodded, slid my purchases across the counter, and paid in cash. She handed me the bag with both hands, the way one might hand over something fragile. I thanked her and walked away. In the parking lot, the sun was bright enough to sting. I sat in the car for a while, looking at the receipt in my hand. Her name was printed at the bottom beside her employee number. No fame, no followers, no filters, just work. For a moment, I thought about what she might have learned. Maybe humility, maybe just endurance. Either way, it was enough. That night, I wrote another letter to the Academy. This one would be my last before retirement. I began with the same line as before, but added more beneath it. Teach them to lead without proving to speak without shouting, and when the noise of the world demands reaction, remind them that silence is not absence. It is composure, waiting to be understood. I sealed the envelope and left it on my desk for the morning courier. Outside, the waves tapped against the pier in slow rhythm, the ocean breathing in a way that matched my own. Some battles end with medals, some with silence. Tell me, what would you have done in her place? Poetic justice wears navy blue. The loudest justice is quiet respect.